We have a wonderful program, and we have a lot of people who have registered. So we're going to wait a minute or two while people log on. Is that what you say now? Log on? Get on? I don't even know what you say. Hop on? Zoom on?
All of the above.
All of the above with the new vocabulary. The new vocabulary. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this very important webinar discussion, conversation. So we'll wait another, we'll wait till like 7:32. Give people time to get on. And sometimes my own computer takes time to like get on. This is great. It's great. I hope you're all well out there and not ill or not having COVID, or if you do. Actually, I had a woman in my women's Torah study watching who said, I'm not putting on my camera because I have COVID and I'm in bed, but I'm watching. So hope if you have it, it's not too bad. It's a mild case. It's hard to stay home again as we enter our third year of this. Okay. Come on in, everyone. I'm watching the numbers and okay, wait another minute. Welcome. I'm here. I'm Rabbi Susan Nanus. I'm here with Elina, Kaplan, and Amy Graiwer. We're going to have a wonderful discussion, important discussion. So I think I'm going to begin because it's 7:32. It's the intro. So if you get on a little late, you're just supposed to see the speakers for now. Just the speakers. We're not going to have, it's not a Zoom meeting, it's a webinar where we're speaking, but we do see your chat. And during the presentation, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We will look at them at the end. And if you have a need to speak, we can make that happen as well. But I want to welcome everyone to this very interesting, exciting program, Anti-Semitism in the Classroom. What are they teaching our children? What are our children learning? And when we were advertising this, I referred to two very alarming anti-Semitic incidents that have happened in California and in Los Angeles and in Florida and in San Francisco. One being that Palisades High School was smeared with a lot of anti-Semitic graffiti a couple weeks ago. And earlier this week, posters, they were like the little bags with posters were thrown all over the Santa Monica school system, 8 campuses, places all over, as I said, San Francisco, saying that the whole COVID agenda was Jewish, and saying this whole COVID, this is the vaccinations, the disease, whatever they're saying was all Jewish. So this is a very alarming anti-Semitic incident. And tonight, we're not talking about combating exactly these anti-Semitic events. This is the first in a series of programs that are going to happen all winter and spring with different speakers and different points of view about anti-Semitism from the left, from the right, what our children are experiencing as early as middle school, high school, and certainly on college campuses, and how to respond, how to react. But tonight, what we're going to focus on is the new ethnic studies curriculum that has been mandated for the high schools all over California, and how it is positioning Israel and Jewish support, Israel, which translates into Zionism, which has been equated with Judaism. So it's anti-Israel, anti-Zionism, anti-Semitic, and how that is being taught or may be taught in our schools. So I'm going to now hand over the program to Amy Graiwer, who is the co-leader of FAIR, which is the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. And she's going to then introduce our guest speaker, Elina Kaplan, and tell you about her. So welcome, Amy.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Nanus, and thank you, Rabbi Leader, too, for having us here tonight. Okay, so why is this important? This is important because we do not want our children, or any children for that matter, being indoctrinated into an ideology that ultimately demonizes Jews and Israel. So why do we need to be educated about what our children are learning in school? To give you a little bit of background, AB 101 is a law that was passed in October 2021 that requires all students in public and charter schools to complete an ethnic studies course in order to graduate from high school in California. There is a group, a Liberated ethnic studies group, that has created their own highly divisive, politically extreme curriculum that not only considers Jews to be oppressors, but actively advocates for the BDS movement, which is the boycott, divestment, and sanction of Israel. This grassroots group is actively shopping their curriculum around to school districts throughout California. And Elina will give you more details about all of this. But the point of this is, if we are not proactive and stay on top of what our children are learning, then this radical curriculum will be allowed to be taught. We have to be our own advocates. Most people are not informed about this issue, and the ones that support these bigoted ideas are certainly not going to oppose teaching them. It's up to us to stand up and speak out to administrators and school board members and call out these hateful concepts that are being presented in the classroom. So to give a little bit of background, why did I join FAIR and how did I meet Elina? I joined FAIR, the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, when I started to see these racist centralist ideas being infused in classrooms. And FAIR is a nonpartisan organization, and it's dedicated to advancing the civil rights and liberties for all Americans and promoting a common culture based on fairness, understanding, and humanity. And it was started about a year ago, based on the Martin Luther King sensibility of the world, where you judge people by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin. And it was through my work at FAIR that I was first introduced to Elina Kaplan at ACES, the Alliance for Constructive Ethnic Studies. So now I present this Elina Kaplan.
Thank you, Amy. Okay, it's a pleasure to be here. First of all, I just wanted to say a big thank you to Rabbi Nanus for organizing this event, and also to Rabbi Leader in absentia for his support, to Hannah Gold for her tech and admin support right as we speak, and to my partner, Amy, for being an amazing thought partner and truly a doer. So a couple weeks ago, the son of a Jewish friend of mine said in passing something about colonial powers such as the US and Israel, ... And she asked, why is Israel a colonial power? To which he replied very matter-of-factly, well, Israel was built on Palestinian land. So my friend responded with a mini lesson on 3,000-year history of Jews in the land of Israel, misinformation, etc. Many of you probably know the drill, either from talking to friends or your own kids. I could tell when she was telling me this that she assumed that this misinformation came from a peer and that her son was simply repeating a peer's words. So I suggested that she ask where it came from, and sure enough, guess where it came from. It came from a teacher, and it came from a teacher in the classroom. This happened to be a civics classroom in 9th grade. I'm talking to you today, I'm here today because I truly believe that today's topic is the #1 issue that Jews in America face today. That this topic is literally where all forms of anti-Semitism will flow and already are flowing. Anti-Semitism in the classroom. As I think Rabbi Nanus said, and maybe Amy, I am the co-founder of Alliance for Constructive Ethnic Studies. We call it ACES for short. And first, I just wanted to say a few words about the connection to our topic to ethnic studies. So ethnic studies, as Amy mentioned, was going to be a graduation requirement now for all public and charter schools in California, and private schools as well will follow, as will other states. The kind of ethnic studies is not specified. And unlike with other subjects like math or history, this actually matters. The state's model curriculum instructs districts to integrate ethnic studies into every grade and every subject. So it turns out that this narrow seeming subject is actually quite all encompassing. ACES itself is a very diverse, nonpartisan grassroots coalition. And our goal is basically to remove ideological agendas from ethnic studies and to enable curricula that build bridges, build understanding, fight racism, and highlight accomplishments of ethnic groups. So in other words, we support ethnic studies, and we support the kind of ethnic studies that the vast majority of Californians and Americans would assume would be in schools. So that's where we kick off. I'm going to share my screen. Hold on 1 second. All right, so share the screen. And okay, let's go into the, well, let me start at the beginning. All right, Amy, could you nod if you can see the screen, my screen right now? With okay, excellent. All right, so it turns out that there are two basic models of ethnic studies. There's something that we call constructive ethnic studies, which emphasizes what I was saying, building bridges of understanding, building empathy, ethnic group contributions, accomplishments, and critical thinking, open inquiry, and different approaches to confronting racism and bigotry. On the other hand, there's another type of ethnic studies, which goes by different names. It goes by the name critical ethnic studies. It goes by the name liberated ethnic studies. Amy mentioned the word liberated as she was talking. They are, when you hear those, they are interchangeable, critical and liberated. And that model of ethnic studies emphasizes an oppressor victim paradigm. And they say this very openly. Everything that I'm about to say is something that they talk about themselves. There's the idea of the world being divided into oppressors and victims, is based on a very specific ideology and a movement that aims to challenge imperialistic colonial hegemonic beliefs and practices, and emphasizes militant resistance as a means to social change. So I found this cover very telling. I came across it a couple months ago, and this is the cover, the new cover of a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is the fundamental text. This is the foundation of how to teach critical or liberated ethnic studies. This quote that you see at the bottom comes from there. The oppressors who oppress, exploit, and rape by virtue of their power cannot find in this power the strength to liberate either the oppressed or themselves. What I found most telling about this cover is that I actually did a double take. So in case you didn't quite hit you, this is a rifle with a pencil, made out of a pencil. And I think that more than anything, any words that I could use kind of paints a picture of what we're talking about when we're talking about this particular model of ethnic studies. So ACES believe that ethnic studies should do all the things that I just talked about, including openly and honestly addressing racism and bigotry, discriminatory treatment, and the various ways that it can be addressed in our society. So ethnic studies in California, and really in the country, you could say, the idea of requiring ethnic studies in schools could be said to be starting with this bill called AB 2016, which was passed. And the objective of this bill was, you can see the quote here, preparing pupils to be global citizens with an appreciation for the contributions of multiple cultures. So I kind of describe this as mom and apple pie, right? Who could argue with that? So from here, we go to what Critical Ethnic Studies Association aims to do, and this is how they perceive ethnic studies and what they emphasize what should be taught as ethnic studies, is bringing into conversation the ways that concerted efforts and collectivized resistance to US imperialism ground our approaches for dismantling the neo-colonial schooling apparatus. The highlighting, by the way, is mine. It's not in the actual quote. So take a look again at where we started. This was the intent. And this is what the intent is of this model of ethnic studies. And this is the liberated one that Amy was referring to. So how do we actually see that? Because it's all well and good to talk about it in theory, but it's much easier if we actually look at specific language and specific principles that are used. So for example, the Liberated Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum, LESMC for short, it includes in their guiding principles, you can look at this first quote, a confluence of this idea of critiquing empire and history and its relationship to, so we've got this confluence of white supremacy, racism, patriarchy, cis heteropatriarchy, capitalism, da 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 da. So you've got capitalism, cis heteropatriarchy, racism, patriarchy, all lumped together. And one of the guiding principles is to critique this, to challenge imperialist colonial hegemonic beliefs and practices. Note how far, by the way, we've come from the original intent. And this is why we talk about the idea that this great concept of ethnic studies that seems like could be used for good in our society and that we could really make great use of right now has been hijacked by something that is really rather ugly. To give you an idea for how you can have different guiding principles, just to give you a sense of the contrast. So take a look at this other guiding principle. And you can see this on their website, by the way. If you go to the Liberated Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum, you can see this principle number 6. It is also from those of you that are familiar with the Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum, the ESMC. These principles are almost identical, though slightly more radicalized, the LESMCs, than the first version of the ESMC. If you're not familiar with ESMC, ignore what I just said. So look at that principle number 6. It talks about connecting ourselves to past and contemporary resistance movements that struggle for social justice on the global and local levels to ensure a truer democracy. Contrast that, so I underline, the underlines again are mine for emphasis. I underline some of the key words there. So you got resistance movement, struggle, and truer democracy, which for those of you that aren't familiar with it, is a neo-Marxist term for the abolition of private property. This is an example of where there are code words constantly that kind of fly under the radar if you're not necessarily familiar with what those code words are. So this contrasted with teaches historic and contemporary racism while inspiring students to feel that their voices and actions count and so on. You can really feel from this, and you can read the rest of the principle, you can really feel what the contrast is between these resistance movements, the struggle, the ensuring a, what is basically a Marxist state, contrasted with teaching historic contemporary racism while inspiring students to feel that their voices and actions count. The second one, by the way, is from Fair Story, which is Fair's organization that Amy was describing to you. So let's take a look at something that I find really useful when trying to understand an ideology, and that is the role models in a particular ideology. Because what you want to understand is who are the figures that this ideology holds up high. And since we know that there's a particular ideology behind this LESMC, it's important to look at who these role models are. And these are taken from, again, the initial drafts of the ESMC, which were written by the key leaders of the LESMC. So you've got a list, you can take a look. These are both Marxist and militant leaders For example, we've got Oscar Lopez Rivera, who led a paramilitary Marxist-Leninist organization that was responsible for over 100 bombings in US cities. So these are figures that are listed in 154 historical figures of color, significant historical figures of color, that do not, however, include, and this is also important to look at who's missing, figures like Norman Mineta, who introduced and advocated for Japanese reparations legislation, figures like Yo-Yo Ma, Thurgood Marshall, Frederick Douglass, all these figures that you would absolutely expect to be there. And notably, guess who's missing? Omitted are Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., John Lewis, and other peaceful leaders that worked as agents of change within the system. So civil rights leaders are actually described as passive and docile, and those are quotes. As I'm saying this, and it hits me every time, I'm reminded of a quote from a journalist that I heard a while ago that talked about the idea that a sign of a healthy society is when people continue to be outraged by outrageous things. And this, to me, is an example of that. This is something that we absolutely should be outraged by. And indeed, Dr. Clarence Jones, who was actually the speechwriter and advisor to MLK, wrote in a letter to the California Department of Education. He wrote this really incredible letter that I encourage you to look at our website, which actually, Amy or Hannah, if you could enter on, as we're talking, if you could put into the chat would be great. It's calastudies.org. If you go there, you can see the full letter. But he wrote about writing in a plea for moral reasoning and decency, for respect of truth and accuracy. He was referring to those drafts of the ESMC / the LESMC, what morphed into the LESMC. Okay, so one question that lots of people ask is, so how does critical race theory fit into all this? I mean, we've got something called critical ethnic studies that sure sounds like it's got the word critical in it. So let's spend a few minutes talking about that. We have a situation now, as many of you have noticed, where media and kind of talking heads have turned CRT, critical race theory, into a political football, and back and forth it goes, and all meaning has been removed from it. The main concern, and I'm happy to talk with anybody about CRT in a separate context, I'd be happy to have a discussion about it. The main concern in our context is not CRT in general, which is a legal theory. You can debate pros and cons of a theory. It's a theory that's been taught in law school for many decades. It's taught among other, not only theories, but specifically racial theories. It happens to be one of the more controversial ones, but it's important to teach it and to study all aspects of it. The main concern in our context is not that in general, but the issue is pushing this very specific ideological theory into K-12 schools and making it the lens through which subjects are taught. So when you hear these talking heads talking back and forth about what CRT is and what CRT isn't, a couple of things to keep in mind. CRT is absolutely not simply talking about racism. CRT is not teaching history honestly. Both of the above are important and are absolutely done with constructive ethnic studies. And they're done without dividing students into oppressor and victim boxes, and is done without imposing a very particular ideological agenda, and it's done without glorifying militant leaders over really seminal peaceful leaders like the civil rights movement leaders. This is absolutely not a left versus right issue. And I guess this is where I do want to share my personal background, which is that I'm a lifelong Democrat. At ACES, many of us, particularly in the leadership, are Democrats. We also have Republicans. It is deeply, deeply offensive to those of us that are committed to fighting racism to insist that if we don't believe in CRT, then we don't believe in talking about racism. Is CRT being taught in schools? Of course it is. Some name it as such and some don't. Some teach it without actually calling it by name. In June 30th of 2021, the National Education Association, the NEA, which is the largest national union of teachers, approved a plan and funding 3 separate budget items to promote critical race theory in all 50 states and to increase the implementation of CRT in K-12 curricula. You can look this up. It's not a question of is it being taught or not. It is absolutely being taught. Again, and the issue is not CRT in general. Don't get caught up when you talk about this subject in particular of talking about CRT in general. It's about using it as the lens. I'm sure there will be more questions on this. I'll be happy to address those. One of the things that I think is really important, we can talk to Blue in the face about our own perspectives on this, but one of the things that I think is really telling is to look at what do people say in their own words? What do the leaders of critical ethnic studies, liberated ethnic studies, talk about when they talk about ethnic studies? So the first thing you see on this slide on the left-hand side is a poster from a demonstration about ethnic studies, where they're really elevating the idea that diversity and inclusion are not ethnic studies. So what are ethnic studies? The idea being that ethnic studies is more about the colonialism and imperialism and talking about oppressed and the oppressed and the oppressors. This is kind of striking because to the average person that doesn't know anything about what ethnic studies is, you would think diversity and inclusion are absolutely about what ethnic studies would be about, because we would want to talk about including all different groups, with a particular emphasis, by the way, on groups that have been marginalized in the past. And we want to talk about diversity. The other one on the right is a very different kind of thing, words that I wanted to put up, and that is a teacher training. This is a quote from some slides in teacher training in Santa Clara, California, where the trainer acknowledged in answer to questions about, well, doesn't this kind of sound like neo-Marxism? So his response was that yes, he acknowledged the Marxist underpinnings and said that yes, that can scare people away, but insisted that teachers must be, and this is a quote, grounded in the correct politics to educate students. The trainer then went on to explain that the white colonial regime of the US is a parasitic system. And so there's a whole bunch of training on that. These are directly from trainings that are done by the LESMC, the Liberated Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum that we're talking about. Here's another one. This is actually, I believe, from the same training. And you see 2 pictures, 2 images of something similar. It gets across a similar concept, the idea of being at the root is imperialism. In the other diagram, you have the center settler colonialism and all these bad things coming out of it. So this is where you have the equivalence of private property, God and religion, together with white supremacy, genocide, and so on. Again, time to be outraged by outrageous things. Speaking of outrageous things, some characteristics of white supremacy that are present according to this framework, this Liberated Ethnic Studies framework, and are reflected in the California mathematics framework, which is currently in the draft form, are individualism, objectivity, and meritocracy. And if we have time, then somebody asked me about ethnomathematics that will get into how these things are reflected in the math framework that talks about, and by the way, while in California it's a draft form, in Seattle, Washington, it's actually passed, and there is an entire body of work and teacher training that teaches students that math is a way that Western cultures propagate racism. And so if we have time, I'll read you a few things from there. All right, so with all that, finally, we get to the anti-Semitism part. And I wanted to share the first part because I wanted to give you some context. I think it's important to understand where a lot of this is coming from. So there's a misguided correlation between economic success and oppressor status. And so, for instance, you have in one example of an ethnic studies course, students will write a paper detailing certain events in American history that have led to Jewish and Irish Americans gaining racial privilege. How they combine the Jews and the Irish, who knows? But the idea is that the emphasis is in gaining privilege. In the initial draft of the ESMC, there are lots of tropes of Jews controlling different things, including the media. And so you have a poem, for instance, that talks about Jews controlling the media. On the right, I just wanted to share, some of you will have seen this privilege pyramid. This was passed around, I think it was a couple of years ago, and it was initially on campus, it was a flyer on different campuses. From this one, I believe, is from the University of Illinois. And you can see ending white privilege starts with ending Jewish privilege, with the Jews at the very top of this pyramid. Again, it's that misguided correlation between economic success and oppressor status, because remember, two boxes, victims and oppressors. And if you are in the box that has had economic success, then you tend to be regarded as the oppressor. And what does Israel and BDS have to do with all this? So BDS, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement against Israel, I'm going to use as simply a proxy for Israel demonization, for Israel condemnation. It's not just about BDS itself, but let's just use that as a proxy for a concept. BDS and Israel condemnation is woven into the very fabric of critical liberated ethnic studies. All 13 founding members of the Board of Critical Ethnic Studies Association are important BDS activists in the movement. And the same association passed a resolution on academic boycott of Israeli academic institutions. Look at that, it's two academics in their conference. This is something that they do regularly. The 4 past conferences of this association each had multiple sessions condemning Israel and promoting BDS. They are so tightly knit that it's impossible to separate them. So how do we see that? How does that play out? Well, here's an example from another teacher training. This one is in Hayward Unified District, where teachers are trained on the idea that in Palestine, the US, Arab countries, the people who are seeking to maintain systems of oppression and racial domination are sharing ideologies and so on. And for example, police strategies have to be transnationalized, with US and Israeli police departments exchanging tactics. Talks about the global prison industrial complex being tested in its extreme forms in Palestine. So this is happening now. This is not theoretical. This is happening now in teacher training. This particular slide is, I think, from sometime in August of the past year. Even in the final ESMC, the final California Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum, so this is the state approved model curriculum, the teachers are not required, the districts are not required, but encouraged to use. These are things that are from the final version of it. So first of all, with very few tweaks, the guiding principles that are in there are still from a book called Education at War. And that book encourages grappling with ways to connect anti-Zionism in the context of Middle East politics to anti-racist, anti-imperialist movements in the US. That quote, by the way, note, is not in the ESMC itself, but I'm giving it to you so that you can understand where the orientation is coming from and why, when you see the kind of training that I'm showing you, why it's coming from this type of approach. One of the required readings, a book called Orientalism, quite old book, Edward Said's book from '78, that some of you have probably read. It repeatedly equates Zionism with colonialism. There's an article, an assigned article that talks about, quote, the state of Israel was founded on Palestinian land. And on top of all that, students are actually encouraged to, in the Arab unit, students are encouraged to volunteer with Arab American Advocacy Association organizations, which have explicitly stated their plans to prioritize BDS as a key part of ethnic studies. By the way, this is the Arab American section is either standalone or is under the Asian section in critical ethnic studies curricula, which is a whole other subject that we won't get into. Okay, the first thing that the LESMC did when they came out with their curriculum, the very first thing that they chose to publish of all the different groups, they didn't publish the African American section, the Asian section, Latino section, or the Native American section. Those four are generally form the core parts of ethnic studies in the critical ethnic studies world. They focused on the Teach Palestine toolkit. And this is available if you want to see, it's on our website, if you want to take a look at the full document of at all. They've since, after we exposed this and after a few articles were written on it, they took it down from the menu items, but the links are still live, so you can absolutely access this. So this toolkit teaches teachers how to educate about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It describes the current apartheid in Israel. It encourages teachers to make clear the connections between the struggle for Palestinian rights and basically all communities of color. It asks teachers to integrate Palestine into your curriculum by incorporating it into discussions of, and look at that list, it's really quite impressive. Apparently Palestine should be integrated into the curriculum when discussing Native American history, gentrification, forced relocation, and even water resources at the US-Mexico border. Again, this is not theoretical. This is actually part of the curriculum that is on the website. Natural question, why in the world is this happening? So much of it is happening under the radar. And if we did a session on the ESMC history, the Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum History, there are stories upon stories that I could tell you about how much happened under the radar when the activists, they refer to themselves as activist academics or scholar activists, and they've used this term freely to talk about themselves as focusing on the activism portion of education. They have adopted a particular mode of working, and they actually tell teachers, and you'll see, by the way, in that toolkit, it tells teachers to fly under the radar when they feel it's necessary. So why is it happening? Much of it is under the radar, and our job is to shine a light on it. The vast majority of the parents, teachers, people simply do not know, including, incidentally, most people of color, many of whom are absolutely not interested in their kids learning that they are victims. Another reason it's happening, we've got some Orwellian doublespeak going on. And so you have terms like critical hope, radical healing, critical pedagogy, all of which sound really positive, but all of which have to do with the idea of dismantling a system. And those of us, like myself, that come from the former Soviet Union, I came as a preteen, by the way, so me less so, I just have a fuzzy sense, a fuzzy deja vu when I read some of this stuff. Those of us that came as adults from communist regimes can look at this and their hair stands on end because this all sounds so familiar. In fact, a couple of folks that I've asked to actually read in detail have said that they can't, and they just find it too traumatic. When parents and teachers do find out the result, many are afraid to speak up. Fortunately, momentum is starting to build, and that's changing. And the more we can speak up, the more of us can speak up, the more it will have a domino effect. So, key question, what can you do? There are a whole bunch of things you can do. And this includes parents, it includes grandparents, it includes everybody in the community because you all pay taxes to support your public schools. You can reach out to principals, school board members, superintendent. You can build relationships with them with the purpose of asking the following questions. How is the ethnic studies curriculum created? How will it be approved? Where in the process is ethnic studies right now? What community oversight is there? Could you be involved in a committee? Many times parents and community members are invited to be a part of it, but you have to ask, what taxpayer dollars are being spent on this? And what organizations are they hiring to help with both the curriculum development and the teacher training? Because you can tell that some organizations that we've just been talking about, namely the main one, the LESMC, is what we're trying to look out for. All right. Here are some resources. So our website is calstudies.org. If you go to /local action toolkit, you will see a toolkit with all sorts of information that will let you decide, do you want to just write a letter or two, or do you want to organize a group of people? It has all sorts of information on what you can do yourself. You can write letters to the editor. You can write op-eds to local papers. You can attend school board meetings. Staying informed is absolutely crucial. As I mentioned, you can get on a district curriculum committee. You can also get onto some district board committee. You can talk to other teachers, parents to spread the word about the concerns. You can keep an eye on legislation in general as it comes up. And you can let us know if you'd like to get more involved. And we can certainly get you plugged into communities in your area. Okay. Here's the website. We have time for questions now. And also, if you think of questions, or if your question doesn't get addressed, please absolutely email us at calstudies@gmail.com, and we will be thrilled to answer any questions we can. So I think I'm going to pause there. Let me stop sharing the screen, and you can see our faces better or worse. Hold on a second. And I'm going to turn it over to Amy, who asked to kick off the question period with a few questions that are frequently asked. So we'll start with those, and then feel free to keep entering questions into the chat.
Elina, thank you so much for this very in-depth and very enlightening presentation of the issues we're facing with the LESMC. My own personal thoughts on some of the best ways to defend against this are send your children to Jewish day school. Both of my children graduated from Bowerman West, and it gave them an incredibly rich and deep foundation in their Jewish identity, as well as instilling in them love and appreciation of Israel. But if not Jewish day school, religious school, Jewish camps, and if you're able, visit Israel. That's an invaluable experience. Okay, so I'm gonna discuss with Elina some of the most commonly asked questions, and then we'll follow with the questions that have been put in the chat. So Elina, how did we get here? How did this happen on our watches?
The short answer to that, and I'm not being trite, the short answer is we got here because we weren't looking. But really, we simply were not looking. And the way we're going to get out of this is we start looking. We start shining a light on this. It has to do with this idea of things sneaking in under the radar. And it's a lesson. It's a lesson for us with this specific issue. It's a lesson for us with what goes on in schools in general. And no, this is not an issue about controlling what the kids are learning or controlling school boards or education. This is about paying attention. It's about noticing what your kids are learning, following what's happening with legislation, reading the news, and simply looking. It's a lesson that I hope that we're not going to have to repeat, but let's do better. We got here because we weren't looking.
Okay, so isn't the ethnic studies model curriculum better now after all the revisions and drafts? What's your take on that?
Yeah, so that's a really common one, a common question. The ethnic studies model curriculum went through, I believe, more drafts than any other curriculum in the history of California. It generated more controversy than any other curriculum in the history of California. How something that is supposed to be so bridge building got to this point is reflective of everything that we've been talking about. Is it better? It's absolutely better. It's a little bit better. Why is it a little bit better? The ways in which it's better is we have removed the overt, believe it or not, in that initial draft and even initial 2 drafts, there were specific references to BDS. And in the first draft, there was an encouragement of students to participate in the BDS movement, along with the Me Too movement and the Black Lives Matter movement. That went away. So did the poem, for example, that talked about the Jews controlling the media. So did the sentence that described the founding of Israel as the Nakba, the catastrophe. So that's good. Here's what's not good. The framework that brought forth these explicit statements has essentially stayed the same. So a few of the guiding principles have been tweaked, but the guiding principles is what determines the framework, basically. They've been tweaked. So for example, instead of capitalism, it now says oppressive economic systems. So you've got wording changes here and there. And Amy's eye roll is approximately how I feel about that. But besides that, the fundamental framework has stayed the same. What's the problem with that? Well, teachers have, in California and other states as well, have a ton of flexibility to teach what they want in the classroom. That's the reason why we're never going to solve this 100%. However, the model curriculum and most curricula in general provide a roadmap for teachers, and they tell them, this is the approach you're going to take. So with the critical ethnic studies approach, the liberated ethnic studies approach, what you're doing is inviting particular types of contents into the classroom. And therefore, while we've removed the words BDS, there is nothing protecting, there's nothing guarding against it coming right back into the classroom based on the current curriculum, based on the current ESMC. Secondly, there's nothing specifying either in AB 101, the law mandating the requirement, the graduation requirement, nor anything else that schools need to use this new version of the ESMC, even if it's a little improved, it still is improved. And instead, as we're finding out very quickly, they can go ahead and use the LESMC. And so we're right now faced with one of the many battles is in Castro Valley, where the school board just last week, last Wednesday, just approved a proposal from the LESMC to do teacher training and their curriculum development. So that's a very long-winded answer to weren't things, didn't we get to a better place? Sure, we got to, if before it was about a 9 on the horrendous scale, we got it down to a 7. It's good, it's better than a 9, but it's a very long way from harmless.
Yeah, that segues into my next question, which is, what about the quote unquote guardrails that we hear about that were included in EB 101? Aren't they supposed to protect against teaching anti-Semitism?
Yeah, so the guardrails are good and they are not magic. And the way that I would put it is the guardrails are only as good as the guards. And guess who the guards are? That's us. Nobody's going to watch this for us. The guardrails say that they're very simple, and I'll share what a couple of them are. The key 2 ones are, number 1, it says that the legislative intent was not to use the rejected portions of the ESMC, the Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum, in teaching ethnic studies. Note, it says the legislative intent. That's, by the way, that guardrail, that particular one, was something that ACEs inserted into the bill. We didn't want it to say legislative intent. We wanted it to actually say that it should not be taught. However, because it is worded as legislative intent, you can absolutely get around it saying, okay, well, that was the intent, but it's not prohibited. Number 2, the only way that anybody's going to bring this up is if somebody's watching. And again, that's us. So in Castro Valley, had nobody caught it, then it would have just kept going. Now it's still passed and there's a battle going on, but at least we're aware of it and we can battle it. So this is an example of where that guardrail was only as good as the guards that were watching it. Another one is a transparency guardrail. And that one says that there should be 2 meetings, public meetings, before a school adopts an ethnic studies model, an ethnic studies curriculum. Well, guess what? In Castro Valley, they didn't do that. They had one, and by that one meeting, they'd already decided to approve the curriculum. Again, who's going to do something about it? Only us. So guardrails, good, not magic, only as good as the guards that are us.
So I have a question. I'm a parent of a high school kid. They come home and they're reading these books and I don't like what the books are saying. I find it offensive. I find it anti-Semitic. I find it anti-Israel. Can I say, go to the school and say, I don't want my kid reading this book? I mean, is it too late at that point? Can you go and make a fuss?
So first of all, the answer is no. It is absolutely never too late. And not only can you, but you absolutely should. There are multiple levels of fuss that you can make.
Right.
The first level of fuss is, of course, going to talk to your kid's teacher. Second level of fuss, going to talk to the principal. Third level of fuss, talking to the superintendent, because that's, if you can get it out of your kid's classroom, that's great. Keep in mind that there are hundreds, thousands, potentially millions of kids that are learning the same thing that you just saved your kid from learning if you were successful. So fuss away and fuss at every level that you're willing to go to get this removed. The other thing that I will say is organizations are standing by, like Stand With Us, that are there to help you address it. So do reach out to them. You can absolutely reach out to ACES as well. ACES is not a Jewish organization, but we deal with a lot of the Jewish issues because anti-Semitism is so core to the work that we do. So you're not alone in this. You have not only multiple levels of fuss, but you have others that can join you in the fuss.
So the first thing we have to encourage parents to do is say, what's your homework and what are you reading? Because a lot of parents just say, go in your room and do your homework, and they just assume they have no clue. And now it's incumbent upon us as Jewish parents to say, I want to see your reading list. What's your reading list? What are you learning in history? I want to know what you're learning in math. Now you're telling us it's making the fuss. And is there the option of going to the school and saying, well, I want to bring in a counter speaker. I want to bring in a Holocaust survivor. I want to bring in an Israeli soldier or whatever. Will they let you do that, do you think?
There are multiple ways to answer that. You can try that. It depends on what the topic is. So I had a conversation the other day. Amy was actually in this meeting with a group of clergy from another synagogue. And the question was, well, you're giving these quotes, like the slide that I showed you guys about showing what, talking about Israel being built on the Palestinian land and so on. You're showing us these scary quotes, but aren't there also other ones that provide some balance too? And the answer is, well, first of all, the answer is no. So, but that's not even the point. The point is that this is an ethnic studies class. This is not an international relations class. This is not a political science class. Regardless of whether or not you bring in a Holocaust speaker, there is not room in this class to talk about Israel performing ethnic cleansing. Now, that said, I recognize that you still might get it. But I think the argument is, why are you teaching this in the first place? Right. If you can't get rid of it, then yes, the next step is probably, well, I don't know if I would bring in, if you bring in a Holocaust speaker, then I would put it in context of why are you bringing in a Holocaust speaker? And if what you're trying to deal with is BDS, then you better bring in somebody that can explain why BDS is completely anti-Semitic and argues against the existence of the only Jewish state in the world. So it's complicated. When you get into a game of counteracting it, I think you're more likely to lose. I think that more valuable is trying to get this ugly stuff out of places where it does not belong.
So we have a question. How are the private schools reacting to this? Are they being as affected, or are they as influenced as the public schools? Do they have to do it, basically?
So here's the answer to the private schools. They currently don't have this as a graduation requirement. However, the UCs do. So in order for students to get into a UC school, a University of California system, they need to have taken ethnic studies.
Wow.
So strictly speaking, no, but in practice, they do. And so private schools are increasingly more and more doing ethnic studies courses and doing the exact same thing the public schools are doing.
So this is a quick question. Can ACEs or FAIR aid people in other states? I know the person who's asking this lives in Arizona.
Absolutely. Amy's nodding her head as well. Absolutely. So ACEs started out in California, and we've been focusing in California, but we're finding ourselves increasingly addressing issues in other states because they are exactly the same. And we said from the very beginning that whatever happens in California, so goes the nation. California drives curricula in almost every case. And so we're watching the exact same thing play out in Washington, Minnesota, New York, Massachusetts, Oregon, and so on. Arizona, across the states. So yes, absolutely.
So here's
FAIR, FAIR has chapters in every single state except for, I believe, in Iowa.
So here's another question. It is my understanding that some school districts have the option of adapting the original version of this curriculum, even though it was not approved. Is that true? In other words, I guess the worst one. Can they still approve? Can they use that one?
So that's exactly what just happened in Castro Valley. It just did get approved. Hayward approved it. There are district upon district in the state of California that are currently approving curricula that are a more extreme version. I call it the ESMC first draft on steroids. It's an even more radicalized version of that first draft of the ESMC. There is nothing preventing them. The only thing that will prevent it or overturn it in states that have already approved it is public pressure. And that's all of you coming forward and saying, look, even this bill, AB 101, said that the intent of the legislature was not to use this type of curriculum. And also educating. In many cases, by the way, what we're finding is that board members are having the wool pulled over their eyes by literally a handful of a couple of teachers, or maybe one board member that is somebody who's part of the critical ethnic studies movement or the Liberated ethnic studies movement, and all it takes is that one person. And you can have the most well-meaning board members that just go along with it. However, when people come forth and say, not here, then it starts to change the equation. And the same goes both ways. The more school districts approve this curriculum, the more of them are going to continue doing so. The more we push back, the more reluctance there's going to be, because ultimately school districts and boards do not want controversy. So when you come forward and say, this is a controversial curriculum, if you can teach ethnic studies, if you can teach how to confront racism, if you can teach all these things in a positive way, why would you possibly choose a divisive, harmful, ideologically driven way?
Radical, yeah, rebellion and a overthrow, it seems like, of our culture, so a concerned person is asking, if your kid goes to a private school and they don't teach ethnic studies, how could you get into UC? They're going to have to start teaching ethnic studies. Is really what's going to happen.
So the truth is, I think there's going to be a little bit of leeway in that. So, and I don't know exactly, you would have to ask your school counselor. It's a reasonable question to ask the school counselor and be concerned about. I don't think that the kids that are graduating next year, for example, are going to have a problem. Don't forget that the requirement itself doesn't kick in until 4 years from now, which, by the way, is very interesting with the schools that are claiming, that are currently just hurrying ahead to adopt this LESMC curriculum, saying that, well, they have to do it because the state requires them 4 years from now. But you can start thinking about it.
So here's a question. Since Paulo Freire's work, I don't know who that is.
That's just for everybody, that's the person, the guy whose book I quoted at the very beginning with the rifle on the cover.
Got it.
That's the author.
Is being taught in many colleges of education. What is ACES doing to address the source of this neo-Marxist critical theory curriculum and beliefs? Are you dealing with
that is such a hard question. We discuss this, I would say, every other week we come back to this question. Right now, I don't have an answer for you. It is a problem. There are some that will argue that until we address the very source of it, which is the education schools, that we're just cleaning up the oil spill while the oil just keeps coming out, right? So I completely relate to the concern. It is definitely a big one. I don't have an answer for you yet, but we will. We're starting to talk with different organizations. We're starting to talk with different leaders. We are aware that it is a huge problem. One of the ways to attack it, of course, is to expose the problem as much as possible with respect to this type of critical ethnic studies, to shine a light on it. And presumably in the long term, the public pressure will have the effect. The more teachers are having the public pressure against it, presumably eventually it'll trickle back. That's a very slow process, and it's scary to think about relying on that process. So great question, and shows a clear understanding of what the issues here are. We're working on it.
So it used to be we were worried about college. Now we're talking about high school and who knows. And I just want to remind people, because tomorrow is International Holocaust Remembrance Day, by the way, that it only took 5 or 6 years in Nazi Germany in the 30s to propagandize and indoctrinate an entire generation of children to become rabid anti-Semites and join, the Hitler Youth and the, SS and whatever. And so this is, as you said, the critical time to look at what our young children are learning, because this is when the indoctrination can take place. And it can take place for the positive, because it could be, ethnic studies could really be a positive thing or a very frightening thing. Amy, did you want to ask anything else? You're muted.
Sorry, I wanted to address one of the questions. I thought the state law just requires a semester class. Why would this curriculum be taught beyond that one class? Elina, I'm sure you have a good answer for that.
Yeah. Sorry, I was trying to. I thought you were about to answer, so I was looking at another question. I'm sorry. Can you say that again?
I thought the state law just requires a semester class. Why would this curriculum be taught beyond that one class?
Yes, the state requires only one semester. It suggests that schools can teach 1 year. The ethnic studies model curriculum, which is the state approved model curriculum of ethnic studies, that's what we keep referring to as the ESMC, has an instruction to districts to integrate ethnic studies into every grade and every subject. So that, by the way, is how we get the subject of ethnomathematics, and that's how we get the teaching of the concept that math propagates racism, and that white supremacy shows up when a teacher insists on the right answer, or when students are forced to show their work. It comes from that. So it's not, strictly speaking, it is not coming from the legislation. It is coming from two places. It's coming from this model curriculum, and it's coming from the world that we live in today. That by passing this graduation requirement, it was basically a stamp of approval to say, this is important. And by the way, I keep coming back to, I do think that ethnic studies in general as a subject is important, just the positive form of ethnic studies. So it's a combination of those two things. It's the world that we live in, that there is a drive to integrate it into other grades, and the activism to do it. And you can be sure, by the way, that where it is happening earlier and earlier is because of the activism, and it tends to not place us in the best of position. So that activism tends to not be activists that are saying, teach the constructive ethnic studies. On the other hand, again, the model curriculum actually instructs it to be infused. So that's how we end up with it getting infused throughout.
So here's a question. When they're talking about colonialism and imperialism and oppressor and aggressor, is Israel the only foreign country
Yes.
mentioned?
Yes. Good question. Thank you. I should probably incorporate that into my comments generally. Israel is the only one that is a foreign country that is mentioned as a foreign.
As opposed to all the other, Myanmar or
Israel is
China.
China.
They have concentration camps there right now for the
all the training and in the curriculum development, Israel is the one. So you can see, as I said, there are these core groups of different ethnic groups, and the Palestinian toolkit stands alone so that Israel can be highlighted as this colonial power that stands above all others. Great question.
I just want to say this is a really important, informative program, Elina, and I'm the one who, when you came to me, I want to thank you, Amy, so much for coming to me with this, because I really had no idea, and I think most people do not had no idea of what's happening right now in our state, in our country. And as I said before, this is just the first of a number of programs we'll be offering on anti-Semitism from all different points of view. And I'm going to close with letting Elina have the final word.
Okay. First, I just want to say there are so many amazing questions here that we didn't get to. They are both in chat and Q&A. Please, I strongly encourage you to reach out. I would love to have a chance to answer these questions. If there's enough interest, I would be happy to come back and do another session for those of you that are interested in doing more of a deep dive. I want to personally thank Rabbi Nanus again for organizing this entire thing, and Hannah and Amy, and thank you everybody for your time and your Zoom bleary eyes. I guess in closing, what I would say is I think that what we're doing here is nothing short of deciding how the next generation of Americans are going to interact with each other, and whether an entire generation of Jewish kids are going to think of themselves as oppressors and Israel as the oppressor. And that's not to mention what others will think of our kids and the alarming anti-Semitism that we're already seeing. Ethnic studies absolutely has the opportunity to elevate the racism conversation, to build bridges, and to bring students and groups together, but not if it puts them into these boxes and pits them against each other. And we need each and every one of you to get involved in any way you can, because otherwise we all fail, and we can't afford to, because the stakes are just too high. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you all. And this program has been recorded. It will be on our Wilshire Boulevard Temple YouTube channel. You can watch it anytime. You can share it with anyone. And we look forward to more discussions. Amy, did you want to say something? No.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for this really important evening. Good night, everyone.
Bye.